You know that moment when something stressful happens, and before you even think about calling someone, your brain already starts building a solution on its own? Even when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, or mentally exhausted, there's still this automatic voice in your head saying, "I'll figure it out." Most people see this as independence, but psychology suggests something much deeper may be happening underneath it. Because people who figure things out alone usually didn't consciously decide to become hyper-independent. It's often a psychological pattern their mind slowly developed over years without even realizing it. And honestly, what makes this fascinating is that from the outside, this behavior often looks incredibly healthy. You seem calm under pressure, responsible, emotionally controlled. You're the person who rarely complains or burdens other people with your problems. Meanwhile, internally, your mind may feel like it's carrying an invisible emotional world entirely by itself. Over time, you become so used to functioning this way that it stops feeling like a coping mechanism and simply starts feeling like your personality. Now, here's where things become psychologically interesting. Researchers who study emotional independence explain that the human brain is constantly trying to predict where emotional safety exists. Not physical safety, emotional safety. Your mind quietly asks questions like, can I rely on people when life gets difficult? Will opening up make me feel understood or misunderstood? Will vulnerability bring comfort or disappointment? And depending on how life answered those questions earlier on, your nervous system slowly adapts. For some people, emotional support felt stable and consistent growing up. They learned that reaching out reduced stress. But for others, emotional support may have felt unpredictable, emotionally exhausted, or unavailable altogether. Maybe expressing emotions created tension. Maybe vulnerability was dismissed. Maybe you became the mature one too early. So eventually, your brain learned something subtle but powerful. Handling things internally felt safer than depending on other people emotionally. And after enough time passes, this adaptation stops feeling temporary. It becomes automatic. You become the person who quietly disappears when life gets hard. The person who says, "I'm fine," while carrying 10 different worries internally. The person everyone assumes is mentally strong because you rarely ask for help. But here's the part most people overlook. Being able to carry everything alone does not always mean you were meant to. Sometimes it simply means your mind became very efficient at emotional survival. Psychologists often talk about how the brain prefers predictability because predictability lowers emotional stress, and relying on yourself creates predictability. You don't have to explain your emotions. You don't have to risk disappointment or misunderstanding. So over time, solitude starts feeling emotionally safer than vulnerability itself. Not necessarily happier, just safer. And honestly, this is why many people who figure things out alone often feel calmer in solitude than in emotionally demanding social situations. It's not because they dislike people, it's because social interaction can sometimes feel mentally expensive. Think about how much processing happens during emotionally heavy conversations. You're reading tone, managing expectations, explaining feelings carefully, while also trying not to feel misunderstood. That's an enormous amount of emotional labor happening in real time. Meanwhile, solitude feels simpler. Your thoughts move at their own pace. You don't have to perform emotional stability for anyone else. You don't have to translate your inner world into words people will understand correctly. And this is where things become deeply ironic. A lot of people who figure things out alone are actually highly emotionally sensitive individuals. They notice everything: tone changes, energy shifts, facial expressions, emotional tension inside a room. Their minds become deeply observant because somewhere along the way, emotional awareness became connected to self-protection. Now, here's something people rarely talk about. When you spend years emotionally relying on yourself, you slowly stop expecting support naturally. Not consciously, you may still deeply value closeness and connection, but internally, your default setting quietly becomes, "I'll handle it myself." And over time, this can create a very specific kind of loneliness that's difficult to explain. It's not necessarily the loneliness of physically being alone, it's the loneliness of always feeling emotionally responsible for yourself. Research consistently shows that the number of people in your life matters far less than whether you actually feel emotionally understood by them. Someone can have dozens of friends and still feel disconnected internally. Meanwhile, another person may only have one or two close relationships, yet feel emotionally safe, seen, and understood. That's because the human brain does not measure connection mathematically, it measures connection emotionally. Do you feel safe around someone? Do you feel understood without constantly explaining yourself? Do you feel accepted without filtering parts of your personality? That's what actually creates emotional connection psychologically. And honestly, many highly self-reliant people secretly crave this kind of connection more than anyone realizes. They're not avoiding closeness, they're avoiding emotional disappointment. And this is where things become even more interesting. People who figure things out alone often become the emotionally dependable person for everyone else. They become good listeners, calm advisors, emotionally steady presences. Because when you spend years learning how to regulate your own emotions internally, you naturally become more aware of emotional patterns in other people too. But this creates another contradiction. You become emotionally available for others while quietly struggling to let other people emotionally support you in return. And honestly, that kind of emotional self-reliance can become exhausting in ways most people never notice. Not physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes from constantly being your own safe place, constantly carrying your thoughts internally because vulnerability stopped feeling natural a long time ago. And before you assume this means something is wrong with you, psychology actually suggests the opposite. Research on emotional resilience consistently finds that highly self-reliant people often develop incredibly deep relationships later in life once they encounter emotionally safe connections. Because unlike people chasing validation from everyone around them, emotionally independent individuals usually value sincerity more than attention. They crave honesty, emotional steadiness, and trust. They don't necessarily want constant interaction, they want relationships where they can finally stop emotionally bracing themselves all the time. And if some part of this feels deeply familiar to you, you'd probably enjoy more conversations like this. Subscribing helps this channel reach people who quietly carry these emotional patterns, but rarely hear them explained out loud. Now, here's the deeper psychological layer underneath all of this. People who figure things out alone often develop what psychologists call a strong internal reference system. Instead of constantly depending on external validation or reassurance, they learn to navigate emotionally through their own internal world. That's why they spend so much time reflecting, analyzing conversations, replaying emotional moments, and trying to understand themselves on a deeper level. Their inner world becomes incredibly active and detailed. And honestly, that's why solitude often feels restorative instead of empty. Solitude creates mental space. Their nervous system calms down. Their thoughts finally have room to breathe. But psychology also makes an important distinction here. There's a difference between choosing solitude and emotionally believing you always have to handle life alone. One creates peace, the other slowly creates emotional isolation. And sometimes the hardest thing for highly self-reliant people isn't learning how to survive independently. They already know how to do that. The hardest thing is learning that emotionally safe support may actually exist. That vulnerability doesn't always lead to disappointment. That being understood is possible even if your brain spent years assuming otherwise. Because at the end of the day, the psychology of people who figure things out alone isn't really about isolation, it's about emotional adaptation. It's about what happens when a person becomes so used to carrying themselves internally that independence starts feeling safer than vulnerability itself. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing yourself differently. You stop calling yourself too distant or bad at opening up. You start realizing your mind adapted intelligently to experiences that shaped you emotionally. And honestly, sometimes simply understanding that changes everything. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough to soften the judgment you've quietly carried toward yourself for years, because human beings are adaptive by nature. Your brain always tries to protect you the best way it knows how, and sometimes that protection looks like becoming emotionally self-sufficient long before you are ever supposed to be. If this resonated with you in some quiet way, subscribe and share it with someone who always seems emotionally strong on the outside. Sometimes the people who carry the most internally are the ones who struggle the most to explain what they're feeling.